Good evening, and thanks for joining. Tonight we are, as always, live if you're joining at 7 o'clock on the 27th, and we are doing something a little different. I mentioned it last week, starting kind of a series, if you will, of podcasts devoted to kind of present arguments against Christianity and hopefully talk about them in a way that makes considering both sides of the argument a little bit easier for the common person. What I mean by that is I was thinking about tonight's topic, questioning the validity of Jesus, and just thinking about the idea of people being able to comprehend or even consider the significance of such a topic. And I was thinking about this, my mind just kind of goes this direction, but I was thinking about in the 15th or 16th century, there was something called indulgences. And basically, if you ask somebody, a common person, what are ways to get to heaven? What do I do about my sin? And, the common belief back then was that you could purchase something called an indulgence, which would basically purchase a lighter or even fully commuted sentence in purgatory. So they were being taught, the Catholic Church was teaching that once you died, you would go to purgatory. You'd spend some amount of time there before you went to your final destination for eternity. And people could purchase these indulgences, which was basically a certificate saying, you were going to be commuted that sentence, and basically essentially purchasing salvation or heaven, access to heaven. And so I was thinking about that because the reason, the question has to be asked of why was it that the Reformation started. A man named Martin Luther wrote something called the 95 Theses, and in that 95 Thesis, he stated this issue of indulgence was not biblical, and that salvation was by grace through faith, and that was the only way a man could be saved. And so he basically, one man stood against the authority of religion in the day, and was excommunicated for it. And anyway, without going into all the history, the question in my mind was, how come more people didn't rise up against such a teaching? And if that was, such a falsehood, if people were being deceived and duped into thinking that this was the way to get to heaven, how come more people didn't fight against it? And the answer is because back in those times, the common person that went to church was not necessarily a literate person. There were actually many illiterate people, and the Bible was also not widely available. And so you had this lack of access to the information that people needed. And even if you had the information available to you, the ability to interpret it, because it was often in Latin and taught in Latin, that people couldn't actually even comprehend what they were looking at. And so I was thinking about that because when it comes to the issue of Christianity, and narrowing it down to specifically talking about Jesus Christ, is there are, we'll just make it super simple tonight. I know that this is, to use your term, is very a binary way to look at it, but there are two sides of the argument. There's those for and those are against, and there's tons of in-betweens of, people who believe a certain way about Jesus and people that don't. But many people's opinions are formed by a lack of information, or information that comes from what they perceive to be an authority on the matter. And so there's a term that I heard today, which is fun. I was thinking about this idea, but a term that you gave me a podcast to listen to, and he talked about something called media bias. And media bias is basically people believe what the media, or the popular media, is portraying. And so what you see on TV, what you see in social media, what you hear in the news, those things influence the way people think and believe. And so to be able to look at Jesus from that perspective, there's a bias involved. And then to be able to look at Jesus from the believer's perspective, there's also a bias involved, because it's possible for people to hear the message of Jesus from people who simply take his existence for granted. There's no argument there. Of course he existed. Why would you question that? That's just a stupid argument. And so there's not the ability for many people, or I should say it's possible that there's not the ability for people to actually even really deeply consider Jesus on the level that he should be considered, and that what we promote in our podcast and in our church and our outreach is to talk about who Jesus is, because Christianity really does revolve around the significance of Jesus, not just his existence, but how significant his existence was. And so my hope is to kind of present some arguments, and I think the thing that makes these arguments worthwhile is the fact that these are things you can just look up on the internet. I found these very easily. So if I want to research things about Jesus, I'm looking up, why believe in Jesus? Why don't believe in Jesus? What do people commonly think about Jesus? What do people think against Jesus? And I'm just looking up just random answers. Obviously my questions are aimed at something, but if I were to just do a simple search, these are answers you could pretty easily come up with. And so we'll just call these the common arguments. And so I'm going to present these arguments tonight, and Pastor Ford is going to help us reason through them. And my hope tonight is to, at the end of this podcast, to hopefully intrigue your interest in the significance of Jesus in general, and not just to stroke one bias over another, but to genuinely present Jesus in a way that makes people want to know more. So, anything you want to add before I go on?
No. Said quite a bit already.
Okay. All right. So, wow, that was very hot. One of the arguments that I came across, and there's a ton of things you can read. I read quite a few different takes on this, but one of them has to do with the historical accuracy of the accounts of Jesus and the significance of those accounts. It seems that many, if not most, genuine scholars believe that Jesus existed. There are some that believe that he didn't, and there are many that believe that Jesus, the man, existed. There was a person who was called Jesus in the time frame that the Bible teaches about, and there were followers, disciples, and stuff like that. And that's true across even different religions. But one of the things that has come up in an argument against the significance, at least, was that there's a lack of evidence supporting the claims of his significance. So he was a man, but maybe the accounts are inflated or exaggerated, and there are pre-existing mythologies that have influenced the accounts. One of the reasons why some writers, authors, philosophers believe that is because right now, at least, the common belief is that the earliest accounts, written accounts of Jesus, were written 20 to 40 years after he died. So there's like this long space of time in between Jesus' death and then the first written accounts, which is what we depend on a lot for our belief in Jesus, or Christians depend on for their belief in Jesus. And so one quote I came across, the Jesus story was pressed from the same template as other mythical savior gods who were killed and resurrected, such as Osiris, Dionysus, Mithra, and Attis, these Greek mythology stories. But there's also something called the Christ myth theory, which is the argument that the accounts of Jesus were influenced by such mythological figures. And so just tossing that out there as an argument, how do you work through that?
Well, generally speaking, it's a lot of these arguments, or so-called arguments, are really they're birthed out of a intellectual pride, and one of the problems with intellectual pride is it overlooks the obvious. I'll give you an example. There was I heard of a meeting that was going on that somebody had come up with a wrist. This is before you had iWatches, or any kind of wrist phone at any kind. Somebody had come up with the idea of actually having a device that is on your wrist. But the amazing part of this is that when your phone rang, and you answered it, you could put your finger in your ear, and you could hear the person talking, and then you could talk back. So there's a microphone on the wrist part. So you've got the microphone here, and then you could just put your finger in your ear. And so everybody was patting themselves on the back, talking about what an amazing discovery this is and how powerful this is. and there was one person that was at the table while everybody's talking about how ingenious this is and how the whole world's going to be buying this product where you stick your finger in your ear and talk on the phone. Well, what if it's for somebody else?
Yeah.
Are you going to reach across the table and stick your finger in their ear while they talk to them? And so that killed the idea. That's why we've never seen it. But it was actually something that had been developed, and it was a real technology, and yet it never became anything because nobody's going to stick their finger in other people's ears. So nobody's going to buy it. And so, but the intellectual pride in all of that, because this is so amazing and it's so high tech and it's so unusual and nobody else has ever thought of that. We're so great. We're so wonderful. We're so awesome. They overlook the obvious. And I feel the same way about these arguments about the myth behind Jesus, because the ideas, the bits and pieces are real. But I would say that if you were to say that a car is not a legitimate innovation simply because it's using bolts and screws that are used commonly, that would be just a silly argument. Because of course you are. Of course you are building your car from known things. You don't build things from unknown things. You build things from known things. And the reality of these myths are they're nuts and bolts of reality, and so you the idea of the virgin birth, for example, is one that's often used and talked about, the myth of another God previous to Jesus that was a God birthed from a virgin. Well, the problem is that the actual prophecy predates all that in the book of Isaiah. And so if you will do the research, you will find out that the idea of something that actually happened, in terms of this sort of mythical composite, when this particular thing happened, you'll find that it was actually the bits and pieces from the mythologies that actually borrowed from the Old Testament. And that it wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that the Bible had or that the believers in Jesus had borrowed from these arguments. It's not even true. And the evidence of the occurrences of things are what's most important. Is that you have evidence, you have eyewitness first accounts. And so the idea of all these concepts and ideas are really unimportant. They're just unimportant. That okay. So what if there was a story about a mythical God that was born from a virgin? That's irrelevant. Jesus was born from a virgin, and he's not a myth. Mm-hmm. And you say, oh no, the reason why people believe this is because of the myth, and they're trying to add to the popularity of Jesus and these kinds of things. Well, the problem with all those kinds of arguments is that if Jesus died on a cross, or let's just say Jesus died of natural causes, then somebody even 20 or 30 or 40 years later trying to fabricate a story that Jesus never did really die of natural causes, he died and rose again from the dead and ascended back in heaven, you're going to have a hard time with credibility. That's still very relevant. So you're going to have a hard time selling that story in the first century. If thousands of years went by and you decided to create that story going backwards, you might have some level of being able to get away from it, but not 20 or 40 years later. Mm-hmm. So my point being is that a lot of these arguments, they don't matter. They're not even important to the facts. Is that there are eyewitness accounts. And it doesn't matter, the idea. So I've been saved 40 years. So does that mean that I am now disqualified from talking accurately about what happened to me on the day that I became a Christian? Oh well, 40 years, been 40 years, too late, bud. If you'd only been saved for 5 years, I could believe your story, but I can't believe it at 40 because you're too old now. See, so a lot of these arguments, they're just silly. I mean, they're not even founded on anything rational. Because when you try to compare apples to apples, you use other examples of things in the present day. They're they're quite fine. Eyewitness accounts are very, very necessary. That's how we run our judicial system. Eyewitness accounts actually count for the vast, the largest amount of weight in a case. A case where you have no witnesses is much more difficult to decide on versus a case where you have witnesses. You have a witness, somebody who saw it. If that witness is credible, then that's it. You don't really need a whole lot more. And the eyewitnesses of Jesus are also accountable, are credible. I mean, and so it's not just his disciples that saw him. He actually, the First Corinthians gives a list of the different people that saw Jesus after he had risen from the dead. And so this isn't something that is not credible. Just because people don't believe something doesn't make it not credible.
Right. So, talk about the miracles of Jesus. Again, this is it's in the same exact vein as the other arguments, but the idea of the claim against miracles performed by Jesus. There's obviously the argument against miracles in general.
Well, yeah, but we don't even need to go that far because everyone has heard of a miracle. Regardless of whether you've actually physically seen a miracle, every single person has heard of a miracle. And so, it isn't like miracles are a rarity. They happen all the time. I know people who are non-Christians, who have witnessed miracles. So, the idea of miracles is not, it's not, first of all, it's not exclusive to religion. It's not exclusive to Christianity. And again, you have credible sources. You have doctor confirmed miracles. So the idea of miracles is not something really to argue because, there are miracles. just because for whatever reason, scientists have decided that miracles cannot be real because I don't want to believe they're real. Okay, that's fine. You're just, you may have gone to school and you got a degree, and you don't believe in miracles, but that doesn't change the reality of miracles. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. You can't change reality just because you have a certain amount of degrees.
So there's a lot of talk about not a lot of talk. Sorry, this is something I've actually never even heard before. I was mixing two thoughts here, but this is the first time I've ever heard a take on Jesus from this perspective. And I grew up in church, and so maybe I just wasn't paying attention when this was ever mentioned, but the idea that, and this is coming from Friedrich Nietzsche, who's very well known, obviously, but he says that he took issue with Jesus' teachings because they promote values contrary to human flourishing. Considered his teachings to be anti-nature in their treatment of topics such as sexuality. And he says concepts like humility and meekness emphasize in Christian doctrine undermine individual strength and vitality. And so it's the idea or the argument against his teachings in general.
Well,
or in specific.
I put that in the same category of everything else. It's just some guy's opinion. I know he's very popular. And he's often quoted by atheists as being the expert on things, but it doesn't change anything because now we know that's not the case. We know that humility is a very strong human attribute. And so there's no arguing that that the idea. It's funny. I'm reading the book that I'm reading. It's called the Team of Rivals, and I would defy anybody to be able to name all the presidents, But I can guarantee you, everybody's going to be able to name Lincoln. Or they're not, or they don't know any presidents. I mean, it's going to be one or the other. It's not. There's not. I doubt very seriously you'll have anybody who won't remember Lincoln. And Lincoln. If you are familiar with him, the one attribute that stands out above all is his humility. And so the idea of those kinds of things, I've not heard that either particularly from Nietzsche, but even if it was the case, it's irrelevant. I mean, it's just irrelevant because it's just flat untrue. It's you could say this and you could speak hypothetically, about that people should be able to live as barbarians, and that true human flourishing is what Vikings were doing, but. I'm sorry, the Vikings are gone. They're not here anymore. So they obviously weren't flourishing too terribly much.
So what about the idea of teachings being anti-nature?
Being anti-nature?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, how Jesus could be talking about anti-nature when we know that we are fallen nature. We're corrupted nature. We know that. And, man is not, ascending to perfection. We do stupid things, and so Jesus taught not to do stupid things. And so yeah, in a sense, he did teach against nature that we're stupid, and that we shouldn't do stupid things. But, yeah. So those kinds of things, they're said to sound profound. Like I said, a lot of this just comes out of intellectual pride of being able to sound like you're saying something amazing, but yet in the practical day-to-day, it's just not realistic. In the practical day-to-day, if you were to take everything that Jesus taught and actually were able to live it out, you would other people, not just you yourself, other people would think you were a great person.
So let me drill in on that issue of intellectual pride, because a lot of this is going to be based like that.
Yeah.
I feel like you're just going to
Yeah.
zoom right through these answers,
Right.
which is not the point.
Yeah.
But like, why does intellectual pride, why doesn't pride take you down a road of integrity?
Well, because it isn't about those kinds of things. Pride is about putting you first. That's all. It doesn't matter.
But what I mean by the question is that if it's an issue of pride, how come pride doesn't go the direction of trying to figure out the truth so that you're actually right?
Well, because that's not the point of pride. Pride is an overinflation of self. It's not the reality of who you really are. It's an overinflation, and so it doesn't care about those kinds of things. Pride isn't interested in being right, being noble. It's not interested in all that. It's only interested in being first. Mm-hmm. But the sad part is it's a very, very driving force in many people's thinking, and when it comes to the idea of Jesus, especially, because to accept Jesus on the basis of who he said he was means you're automatically not first. And so that's why the problem, is really, if we were to talk about anybody else or anything else, it wouldn't matter, but what matters is Jesus is the top of the food chain. And so that's why, people who want to be perceived as being in the upper part of the food chain, they have to discredit Jesus, because that's you get to the top of the food chain by pulling other people down. It's the classic is referred to as crabology. Is you don't actually get to the top. You pull the top down to you. Mm-hmm. And that's often what happens. And that's a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. That's what's happened over the years. Is these are people just trying to pull Jesus down for no particular reason other than just simply to try to discredit who Jesus is, so that they have a chance of being on top. Mm-hmm. That's the thing I think is so ridiculous about atheism. I saw a debate, it was a number of years ago, with Christopher Hitchens, and Christopher Hitchens made the statement. He said, that he doesn't like being called atheist because there shouldn't be a such word. and the reason is because atheism is the belief, it's basically not God. Well, you have to have God to have a not God. That's why you don't have a ghosts, or something like that. Is because there's no an anti or a non-belief in ghosts, or a non-belief in this, or a non-belief in that, that's already known to be unreal. You don't need a non-belief word to talk about it, because the non-belief word insinuates there's a belief word. And which I thought, as I was listening to it again, like I said about intellectual pride, I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, well, there you go, there's your answer. God exists because there is a word theist, and there's also a word atheist. They are part of our vocabulary because they define that people that do exist. They indeed exist. And so if those people indeed exist, then there are those that don't believe, and there are those that do believe. And so you can't get rid of that. You can't just walk that backwards, because it's proof. It's proof that God exists. If God didn't exist, there wouldn't be believers and non-believers. There'd be nothing. It wouldn't be anything.
So, what about let's just talk plainly about the significance of Jesus, because all these have kind of danced around that issue. But do you think that do we really have common demonstrations of the significance of Jesus? And I mean, talking about people today following somebody who existed, that long ago,
Yeah.
and his.
Well, that's the reality of Christianity. This is the undeniable fact of true Christianity, not the religion of Christianity, but true Christianity. Because there are many that claim to be believers in Christianity, but they're not actually Christians. They just believe in Christianity, and they are negligible isn't the word that I want to use, because that implies that there's a small quantity of them, and that's not what I mean. But they are discardable. You don't have to listen to what they have to say, because what they have to say is not really a true representation of who Jesus really is and what Christianity really is. But those who are Christians, they're genuinely, truly Christians, not just people who have a belief in Christianity. They've had a personal encounter with Jesus. They've personally encountered Jesus, and that encounter has brought a transformation to their lives, and they're not the same people anymore. What they were before they became Christians and what they were after they met Jesus are completely different. And this is something that happened in a moment, not something that's happened gradually over many, many years. Something that's happened in an instant of time.
Mhm.
And so that's the credibility of Jesus right there. Is the proof is in those who follow him, and that transformation.
There's a quote that I came across, an interesting quote. It says, no testimony is sufficient. This is an 18th century philosopher. He says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish.
See, those are the kinds of things that are that's a lot of words that don't mean anything. It's just made up stuff. It's just made up stuff. It's silly. I mean, it literally is. It's just, you make the sentence long enough where people forget the first part of it by the time they get to the last part of it, and then people think you're amazing. And it's like, just because you know how to use conjunctions and verbs, and are able to spin sentences that are too long for people to remember by the time you're done saying it. It doesn't make you a genius. It just it makes you an English scholar. It doesn't make you intelligent. Yeah, there's no point in even dealing with that, because it's just silly. It's just silly to say things like that, because you just says who. I mean, says who? Is that something scientifically proven? This is just because you say it that we're just supposed to okay. Well, I guess we have to live by what you say. It's like, no, no, it's not necessary. If my life's been totally transformed by Jesus, it really doesn't have a blind anything to do with the fact of whether or not I was lying about it being more profound. There's no, it doesn't. That's just silly.
So do you think that there's more of a reason for people like if you were to say from your perspective, and I've got more here, but so I asked ChatGPT, why should I believe in Jesus? Just to see what ChatGPT.
Yeah.
It's funny because ChatGPT gave a very, very good argument.
Well, and the reason is why ChatGPT can come up with a very good argument is because it is only dealing with the facts of the case. It's not dealing with the emotional investment that many
Like
people.
intellectual pride that you're talking
Well,
about.
yeah, and there's an emotional investment. Christopher Hitchens is famous for being an atheist. He's not famous for what he really was. Yeah, if I was to ask, what was Christopher Hitchens? Really, I mean, what was he? Before becoming well known as an atheist. It's not. He's a scholarly guy, but it's not. He's not known for that. He's known for his outspoken atheism. He's got an invested interest in God not existing, and so he's got to keep throwing that out there because it's what pays the bills. It's what makes him who he is. And honestly, that I think is the biggest snag when it comes right down to it, is that most atheists are more popular for being atheists than they are for what they actually do. I've never heard Richard Dawkins referred to in any kind of way, of brilliance like other scientists are. That he discovered this or that or the other thing that was absolutely amazing. The only quotes you ever get about Richard Dawkins is his contemporary confirmations of Darwinism, but it's still focused on atheism. It's not focused on anything else. Darwinism, I mean, we need to start with the fact that Darwinism does not prove that God does not exist. That's not reality, and there are many scientists who believe in Darwinian evolution and still believe that God, because Darwinian evolution doesn't deal with first principles or first events. There's another word for it, but anyway, that will work. The idea of origins. It's not that doesn't happen from Darwinism, and but my point in that is that it's an investment. They're emotionally invested in God not existing. They were people that for whatever reason got upset at God, and then they made it their life's ambition to be a famous atheist. And that really is what it is. I mean, otherwise, why would you want to do it? Why would you want to become a famous atheist? It's called new atheism, and there's a lot of people that are joining in with this new atheism, and there's only one visible, one obvious reason for becoming a part of this new atheist movement, is you want to be known. It's as simple as that. You just want to be known. And the silly thing is you want to equate God to Santa Claus, but you want to be known as being an anti-Santa Claus. It just doesn't make any sense.
So from your experience, thinking about like arguments in general against, and I'm talking about the validity of Jesus, but more specifically his significance. And like I said, hopefully to engage the mind of people who are curious to actually consider more than just the things they hear on the surface level. To actually, like you said in the beginning, drill a little deeper. You mentioned the prophecy about Isaiah, and there being this pre-existing, we'll just call it information about Jesus before he even existed, right? And so before he ever came to the earth. But are there any arguments that you would say are reasonable to have
About what?
against the validity or significance of Jesus? Now, I'm talking about arguments from a position of I don't know, or this is what I think or have heard or believe, or but willing to hear the answer in the support of his significance.
Well, after 42 years of being a Christian and hearing the same well-worn arguments again and again and again, and having looked into these arguments and seeing that these arguments, they don't hold water, kind of my answer is no. There's no real argument against the reality. In fact, at times when I'm the most um, discouraged. I don't know if I want to use that word or something a little bit bigger, but when life isn't going the way I want it to go, and I'm perplexed. Perplexed is probably a better way of putting it. When I'm perplexed at the circumstances and their relationship to me, God, the world, life, all these, where they all, you know, intersect. The reality is that there's just no other way that the world could have come into existence than by a supernatural creator. There just isn't. There isn't. I mean, it's just as simple as that. There isn't. Atheists accuse Christians of coming up with, the God of the gaps, and that, oh, if you don't know the answer to something, God did it. But and I've mentioned this before, is that trying to argue that, that God is a fact, or that putting God in as a factor, in an equation, is an unintellectual thing to do, or an irrational thing to do. Well, we do that all the time. We have constants that we plug into equations all the time. And those constants are verified by their usage and how many times they seem to work. That's what actually causes those constants to become more sure. It isn't that we figured out the constant and then we give it a label and then we just throw it in there. It's no, given if this was a constant, then it should work in this situation, in this situation, in this situation, in this situation. And so you start running equations and running numbers, and you realize that yes, indeed, it does hold weight. Then you say, okay, but if you run into a circumstance that doesn't hold weight, well, then you don't abandon the constant, you modify the constant. And that's exactly the same reality with God, except that we're not modifying the constant, we're modifying our understanding of God. And so when you think a certain thing, like, if I use some, theology that has been disproven, like prosperity, that the prosperity theology, that if you, for example, if you tithe, you're going to be prosperous financially. Well, that's not always true. And I know personally that that's not always true. And because there have been times where I have given large amounts and have just been sacrificial. Wasn't something that just turned around to be to my benefit later on. That doesn't mean that those things don't happen. It just means that that's not a constant. That the prosperity gospel is not a constant, that every time you give, it's going to equate out to some reciprocation, that it's going to benefit you financially. And so you modify your thinking. You don't modify God. That was your wrong estimation of God, so fix the constant. God doesn't, every time you tithe, God doesn't turn around and shower money on you. And so that's just a revelation of who God is. But that doesn't mean that you remove God as a constant. And as a Christian, I do have that as a constant in my life, that I know that God does promise to open the windows of heaven, that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, that God sets down one and brings up another. And so that constant still remains in my life, that I know God is in control, of things. And so I am obedient to him because I know he's in control, and I know by being obedient to him that constant is going to be a positive factor in my life. And so the idea of these arguments that would pull people into a disbelief, you know, well, I've researched them. Okay, I've looked into them. So yes, you can look into them, but I've looked into them having already understood that by looking into these things, they're not going to convince me of what I already know to be true. That's the issue, is that, and it's not going to, there are, I could, if I got into a debate with an atheist, I could come up with more plausible things from the Bible that are questionable than any atheist could, because I've read it way more than atheists read it. There are timelines and dating, and there are scriptures that are recorded in Chronicles that are recorded in Kings, and they're recorded differently. They have different. I could show all kinds of reasons to disbelieve, but those are not reasons to believe or disbelieve. They're not. They are just simply. They are things that you have to work through. You have to look into it. You have to read about it. You have to take the time and the effort and the energy to understand these things, because they don't change anything. The fact that there are differences of accounts, that doesn't change reality. Because the Bible was not. The Bible's not given, God didn't give us the Bible, and the idea. There's these ideas about the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible, So does that mean if there's a Bible produced that has a typo in it, that God doesn't exist? Because somebody made a mistake, and does God correct every Bible that comes off of a printing, press, or, well, not a printing press anymore, but out of a printer, does God correct every one of those? What do you think? What are you thinking? Is it possible to have typos? The number, especially with digital stuff, the number of mistakes in digital copy, is incredible. It's like people just stopped thinking about it. As I've seen tons of electronic documents of translations of the Bible where they have typos and things like that, and it's like that doesn't change anything, because that's not the idea of inerrancy. The idea of inerrancy is that the story is credible. It's not about the construction. It's the story is credible.
So let's talk about the divinity of Jesus. There are a bunch of quotes and stuff like that. I didn't put any of them down, but there's a whole bunch of different takes on this idea. And I think probably the better way to start this kind of last portion of the podcast is, why is Jesus' divinity significant at all?
Well, because it's the entire story. The whole story is that Jesus is God. That without that, you have a weird story. Because and this is one of Dawkins' complaints, is that God had a son, and he put his son on the cross, and the picture is of like a 5-year-old. That's the picture that they try to conjure up, is that because God's been around forever, and his son has got to be younger than him, obviously, right? His son can't be the same age as the father, because the father was first, right? And so all of these misunderstandings, they start from all these misunderstandings, and so the younger son, is forced by the older father. Why didn't the older father come and die on the cross? Cheap, sissy jerk. I mean, these are the implications. Yeah. Is that this kind of thinking, but it comes from having no concept whatsoever of the reality of of the Trinity. When you don't have to believe in the Trinity if you don't want to, but you can't create your own definition of the Trinity. If you're going to talk about Trinity, you have to talk about it according to its definition, not according to your definition. That Jesus is not the younger son of the God the Father. That's not the case. God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, three in one, always have been, always will be. You may not like that concept, but that's the starting concept. So Jesus coming to the earth is just simply a part of the Godhead. And it isn't the demands of the Father that brought Jesus to earth. It was the cooperation of the Trinity that Jesus decided to empty himself and become a man. But in emptying himself and becoming a man, that automatically means he is now inferior. And so everything that Jesus wrote or spoke that was written from the standpoint of this God who was born, who's now 33 years old, and talking, because this isn't a game. It's not it. We don't understand these concepts, and we think, oh, that's so stupid because I've never heard this before. And it's like, here we go again with the intellectual arrogance, and pride is I've never heard anything like this before, so it's got to be stupid. That's what children do. That's how children talk. Children, oh, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Exactly. Because what have you heard in your 8 years of being on this earth? You probably haven't heard anything. And so it's just saying the same thing. It's not any different. It's saying the same thing. And so, so the idea of Jesus being God and of his decision, not under some compulsion, but under his decision, and this was a plan that was orchestrated even before the world began. So this is not a plan that was concocted along the way because of a failed experiment. That isn't the case. This is a plan that always had been, because this way of doing things. So God, we have to start from square one, which is God decided to create the world a certain way. End of story. And he decided to create people a certain way. we may not like that, but that's what happened. And we are a product of being created a certain way. And so part of that plan of God includes, the coming of Jesus to the earth, and emptying himself, of his godhood in order to be a man, so that he could be a genuine sufferer and suffering for the sins of humanity, even though he himself never sinned, which is a whole nother element in its own. That's all you would need is just one sin from Jesus, and you could discredit the whole story. But why is there not another man like Jesus? Why is it only Jesus who never sinned? So you have my point in all this is you have all the evidence that you need to see the truth and the reality of all of this. The issue really is accepting it or not accepting it. And so when it comes to, Jesus being God, that's who he is. It's not something that needs to be figured out intellectually. He is God. No. There was a Jesus, but he wasn't God. Well, that's just you making a concession. Because it wasn't too long ago you said Jesus didn't exist, and now you're saying, okay, Jesus existed, but he wasn't God. We're just still playing a game here. You're still trying to impose your thinking about a thing, and not the facts of a matter. And so these are the facts of the matter. And so Jesus being God is that is what it is. He was God. He's not God. And just because Jehovah's Witnesses don't think so doesn't make him not God.
So this is kind of my last question. I think it's not necessarily a last question, but if Jesus really is this significant, why why is it that there is such a struggle around the person of Jesus? I mean, even biblically speaking, the Bible talks about the you know the stone which the builders rejected has
Yeah.
become the chief
Yeah.
cornerstone.
Yeah.
So it's talking about something they rejected,
Yeah.
actually in the long run being the most
Right.
significant of all
Yeah.
of it in the first
Yeah.
place. And so you mentioned this idea that there are some people who have, so if we could just categorize it, plainly, the people that they don't believe in Jesus. There are people that believe in Jesus but have never had an encounter with him, and then there are people who have had an encounter with him, whichever way that takes each one of those. But how come more people don't have an encounter with Jesus? What keeps people from experiencing?
It's super simple. I mean, it really is. It's called intellectual pride.
I actually had versed this in my head to say barring intellectual pride, and I forgot to say it.
Because that's the issue. I mean, when it comes right down to it, truthfully, anybody who, oh, I'm open-minded. Anybody who is really open-minded, they would know Jesus. It is that simple. It's just flat that simple. I've talked to people, I've tried it, and it didn't work for me, and then when they start to tell me what they mean by they tried it, what they meant is they stuck their toe in the water, saw that the water was cold, and didn't take it any further. And it's like, that'd be like somebody, going to a swimming pool and going, oh, no, I know what it's like to swim, because I put my toe in the water, and the water was too cold. And so I've never actually found a swimming pool warm enough for me to get into, but I know about swimming. And that really is all. That's all it is. It really is that simple. Until you get into the cold pool, beyond your comfort level, you're never going to know how to swim. And until you are willing to go beyond your own comfort level to experience Jesus, you're never going to experience Jesus. It is flatly just that simple. That anybody, that's why the Bible gives us these, which are twisted by people who don't know, claiming to be Christians that are not. They're twisted, but that's why those scriptures are there. Things like taste and see that the Lord is good, and confess with your mouth and believe in your heart, and you shall be saved. These are very simple things to do, but they're things that many people are just unwilling to do them. They're just plain unwilling to do that. I remember the day that I did that, and I remember living 20 years having no concept of God, my ideas of God was, if God was real, he should do what I say. That was the only God that I thought about, was a God that did what I said. He's pretty much my servant, and he did what I said. And so anytime that anything happened in my life where what should have happened, from my servant God, then it didn't happen, was just more proof that God didn't exist. But the night that I made the decision to become the servant myself and let God be God, well, that's when everything changed. That's when I met God. And then I realized, now I know why I never met God before, because he doesn't want to be my servant. He has no intentions of being my servant. He's never going to do what I say. He's never going to come down and go, okay, listen, I'll tell you what, if you do this, then I'll do that. This is not like it. He's a king. He's a king. He's God. He created the universe. He created us. We have no say in the matter. And so when it comes right down to it, if you want to know God, then you have to accept him on his terms. And that's just something that many people just refuse to believe. I've talked to people, it's funny because I've talked to people about this for so long, and we've even agreed that their present belief system is flawed. And then they'll say, well, I'm just going to stick with it anyway. And it's like, so you would rather stick with a flawed belief system than to attempt to find the true belief system. And they won't come out and say it, because that would be, that would be too humble to say something like that. What they say is, well, I don't know that it's as flawed as it seems to be. and I'm going to just keep looking into it. The number of times I've had people say to me, "Oh, wow, everything that you're saying makes complete sense. I'm going to have to look into this more." And what that means is it means like what it means in police, in court speak, is when a judge says that the case is going to be what's the term, taken under advisement. It means you won, but I don't want to say it publicly because I don't want to make myself look bad. And it's literally what it means if it's going to be taken under advisement. And so what that means is it'll be talked about in a back room somewhere, and then a decision will be made that no, you were right, and so that's it, you won, for the most part. But it's a way of saving face. And so people who say, "Oh, I'm going to look into this," it's a way of saving face. They're going to walk away and just keep believing the same things they've always believed. Because they're not going to go look into it. They're not. I've had people, "I'm going to read the Bible, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do the other thing, I'm going to look into this," and then I talk to them later on, and they never do. Mm-hmm. They never do because then they'd have to change what they believe, and that would mean that they'd have to become a servant of God, and they don't want that.
There's a question that came up on the chat here. I'll ask it. This says question answered, but I'll ask it anyway. Pride, a need to be right or in control. Ego, are these all partners with each other? That keeps us away from humility and the need for Jesus. How do you talk to this side of people?
You don't. There's no point. Your ego. So ego, pride. These ideas, these concepts are not. They're not. They're wild animals, and have no intentions of being domesticated. And they might, I remember seeing a video of a woman going up and petting a tiger. She actually walked across. And at first the tiger was okay with it. And it was funny because the tiger was like a classic cat, it was rubbing its head against it. And it was like the tiger went, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm a tiger." And then turned around to bite her hand, and she pulled her hand back, and there were people watching and said, "You need to get out of there." And it's like, that's pride. That's how pride works.
You're talking about the woman, right?
What?
The woman is pride. That's
no.
Oh, you're talking about the cat.
No, how the tiger was. The tiger was like, "Whoa, wait a minute! I need to attack here. I'm being petted by a human. I'm digging this, and I shouldn't be digging this. I have a reputation to, my other tiger friends are going to call me a wuss, or call me a cat. But no, what I mean by that is just that, is that you'd have to. You don't want to purposely attack people's pride and ego, because they are together, yes. You don't want to attack them, because then you lose your audience. There's nothing to be gained by assaulting somebody's pride or ego. But it's just kind of like, it's like being in a conversation and two people are standing there, one keeps butting in, I'm talking to them right now. Just relax. So you'll get a chance to talk in a minute, but I want to talk to them first. You have to do that when it comes to dealing with people, and when pride begins to talk and arrogance begins to talk, it's like, well, I just want to talk to you for a minute. I don't want to talk to the part of you that's afraid to be wrong. I want to talk to the part of you that's open to learning.
Yeah. Well, I'm out of questions. I think that was good. We'll be here again next week. I forgot about. We always open it up for off-topic questions. If you have any, you can throw them in now. We'll wait until 8 o'clock. It gives you 2 minutes. I apologize. But we do always open it up for off-topic questions if you have any. Otherwise, while we give time for folks to send any in, we encourage you to, I want to specifically ask that if you folks that, again, I mentioned this last week, if you know folks that have any issue with Christianity, and their argument, or their thing, the thing that is their sticking point, you can throw those in the comment section. Really do encourage you to do that. Just if you're bold enough to just
and
do
be
it.
patient, because For some reason, I don't get alerts when somebody puts in a comment. I have to go back and look at it. I'm not sure why that is. So if
We'll,
anybody
we'll
has
keep
any,
an eye out for them.
if anybody knows why that is, put it in the comments.
But I'm happy to, take those things into consideration, and if not do a whole podcast on it, at least work it into some of these other topics. I have a whole list of topics to cover over the next few weeks, but really do encourage folks to, we welcome your feedback, and so, throw that stuff in, and we will keep an eye out for it. But other than that, we have, as every Tuesday night, we invite folks to come and be a part of our midweek service. That's tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. The address and information will be on the screen in a second, but we also have our upcoming monthly concert. And so if you like live music and you're in the local area, I encourage you to come and join us for that next, not this Saturday, the following Saturday. And so, thanks for joining tonight. We'll be here again next week.